Good morning, everyone. And for those of you in the room, well done for making the right choice and getting up early rather than overdoing it in the Midland Bar last night. My name is Robert Eade. I am Head of Health and Social Care at Policy Exchange, and I'm delighted to be hosting today's event, which is delivered in partnership with the Physiological Society and titled Following the Science. What should the UK learn from the COVID-19 pandemic when it comes to the role of science in public health? Now, it is clear that the science agenda has never been more high profile, and it's been demonstrably impactful when it comes to the pandemic. But the reality is that science has got a role in lots of other public health challenges, from things like healthy aging to also looking at broader challenges we face as a society, such as climate change. So I'm delighted that we've convened such an esteemed panel of experts to explore these issues and debate and discuss, and look forward to your questions later. So we're going to open, as is convention, by asking each of the panelists to set out some thoughts for 2 or 3 minutes, and then we'll throw it out to the group for your questions. So first of all, I'd just like to introduce everyone. So to my right, we have George Freeman, who is the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Science, Research and Innovation, freshly minted at the Department for Business. To my left, we have Dr. Susan Mitchell, who is Head of Policy, Prevention, Detection and Diagnostics at Alzheimer's Research UK. On the far side, we have Richard Maughan, who is Senior Director for UK Policy and Public Affairs at Pfizer. And then lastly, we have Professor Mike Tipton, who I believe is an incoming trustee at the Physiological Society, but his main job is the Professor of Human and Applied Physiology at the University of Portsmouth.
Correct.
So we'll start by handing over to the Minister to give some opening thoughts.
Well, thank you, Robert. And thank you, Policy Exchange, for putting this on. Headline, in case fire alarm goes in 30 seconds. COVID has been, I think, the most extraordinary warning to the world about the impact of decadal systemic neglect of population health. The two countries which were ranked officially as top of the Global Health Security Index, the United States and the UK, were actually hit hardest, most disproportionately, because of the chronic disease syndrome, the obesity-related cardiorespiratory and health inequalities reality that left us far more susceptible than we needed to have been. And I think this is a moment for all of us who really care about population health, public health, and the health of an economy and the relationship between health and prosperity. This is a moment not to lose. Businesses around the world, sectors, have suddenly had to confront the value of health and the cost of disease in a way that none of us would have wanted. But given that it's been done, let us make this a moment to properly harness and never again go back to neglecting population and public health. Some thoughts to kick off the discussion, and it's just brilliant to be here with Richard and Susan and Mike, because this conversation needs to be shaped and led as we come out of this pandemic. Those of you who don't know me, I'm elected 2010, background 15 years in mainly biomedical, some clean tech, some agri-tech investing, First Minister for Life Science in the Coalition, and suffice to say it was quite frustrating to leave government on the eve of the great Battle of Britain, of the great defining moment in which life science was coming to the rescue of the globe and this economy. And I spent the 18 months out of government on this subject, setting up the Reform for Resilience Commission. You can Google it, www.r4rx. And it's about exactly this theme. We've set up an amazing panel of commissioners. My co-chairs are Jose Manuel Barroso, Malcolm Turnbull, and the Professor of Health at Harvard, Michelle Williams. 17 commissioners, 4 global hubs, 1 in Asia Pacific, 1 in India, 1 in Europe, and 1 in North America. We've raised thick end of $4 million from corporates who really want to take this agenda seriously and want to make sure, the pennies dropped, that the security, the economic resilience of their workforce, workplace, supply chain, their global growth prospects are fundamentally linked to public health. And I dream of us getting to a point where we're red, amber, green rating cities, companies, sectors on how health resilient their supply chains are and how health resilient their populations are, so that we start to mainstream healthier growth in globalization. So I think this year is a year where at COP we'll be talking cleaner growth. We need to be talking healthier growth and making the point that cleaner and healthier growth actually go hand in hand. And I was never more struck by that than when I went to DFT as Minister for Decarbonisation. And guess what? 80% of the things we need to do if we're going to have a healthier growth economy, get out of the car, walk a bit, take a bike, active travel, those daily changes are exactly the things that we need to tackle the long-term public health challenges. So that's the headline. Very specific subpoints. Firstly, first lesson, strategies work. I mean, we wouldn't have been able to pull off the global vaccine leadership if we hadn't done the hard grind in 2011 to 16, the life science industrial strategy, investing in genomics, launching Genomics England, investing in our digital capacity, setting up the catapults. All that work laid the foundation for the vaccine task force success. Long-term strategies work. Secondly, this issue is global. There's not much point the UK being fully vaccinated and fully ready to get back to work if the global economy is still sitting in the departure lounge. So fundamentally committing to that, not just global vaccine rollout in the next 6 months, but making sure that the World Economic Forum, the OECD, that we mainstream this so that never again is globalization stopped, the global economy stopped. Thirdly, the role of data, and boy has this been a wake-up call to policymakers, but also, I think, to businesses, that they need to be tracking health data. And if we let that slip, in my part of the world in Norfolk, weekly meetings looking at data. It was a joy to me as a former digital health minister. Finally, my care community, my county council, my NHS, every week looking at data. It was clumsy, it was a bit slow, it wasn't live, it was written down on paper, but it was data. And actually tracking the reality of longer term disease epidemiology, but also using data in real time to allocate resources, key lesson. Fourthly, pace and speed. Extraordinary what became possible in the crisis. As we proved with the Zika and Ebola virus, you can actually do things in 3 months that used to take 3 years. Let's not lose that capacity to move at speed. Care homes picking up the phone to the NHS locally and saying, can you move 5 patients quickly because we need them? Yeah, no problem, don't worry about payment. Things starting to happen that we really need to happen. And my last point would be, I think the reality is that actually that susceptibility, in the end, we centralized because of COVID to manage a national crisis. But in the end, those pockets of deep susceptibility speak to the levelling up agenda. There are pockets around the UK where life chances are 20 years lower than in the more prosperous areas. The deep pockets of public health, population health inequality have got to be tackled. And at the other end, we have to harness the kind of worried well Fitbit generation and build a digital community and use them to drive clinical trials and a broader, more integrated healthcare economy. It's an incredible opportunity if we get it right.
Thank you very much, George. Susan.
Thanks. Obviously, coming from a biomedical research charity in the dementia space, I'll be speaking from the context of dementia. So I guess the first point I'd like to make is obviously I think COVID has particularly highlighted the real vulnerabilities that people with dementia have faced. We know last year that about a quarter of the people who died with COVID also had dementia. There are 850,000 people in the UK who have dementia, so the scale of the problem is huge. And there are no treatments available. So, I mean, I think there's also huge potential for rewards here, and I think COVID has highlighted some of those vulnerabilities. I think secondly, and this sort of obviously agrees with some of the points that George has just made, I think COVID has highlighted that with government support, the right investment, research endeavour, we can make huge strides at pace, which is hugely promising. And I think some of the challenges that many researchers and clinical researchers have faced have been overcome. So can we apply some of those lessons in other aspects of the life sciences agenda? We also know that I think just more generally the kind of public understanding and awareness of science is actually much more heightened. In our recent Dementia Attitudes Monitor, which is the second wave of this monitor, we found a marked increase in people who were interested actually in participating in research, up from 50% to 69%. So how do we capitalise on that kind of wider engagement with science and research and the opportunity it can give? I think there's also the point that with things like the vaccines task force, we saw huge progress, the ability to kind of pull together horizon scanning, sort of deployment, implementation in one was hugely impactful. And I certainly think in a space like dementia, we would be keen to see a similar approach applied. I think the next point is that COVID really has highlighted some of those public health issues, as George has already said, those kind of challenges around huge areas of health inequalities. So in the dementia space, we know that some of the risk factors of dementia, such as smoking or not managing diabetes, are also associated with worse outcomes for COVID. I mean, this is, again, that opportunity to kind of pull together the learning. We also saw in some recent polling we did that actually the COVID pandemic has been a really opportunity for people to reflect on their own health. They're interested in improving their health, but how do we enable them to do that? We know that 40% of dementia cases may actually be avoidable through modifiable health and lifestyle factors. Yet actually only a third of the population know they can do anything to reduce their risk of developing dementia. We need to kind of use some messaging, use different approaches to actually enable people to look after their health better. And then I think my final point is just that, public health is a really broad concept and we can't look at it in isolation. From a dementia perspective, we know that identifying people at risk also means identifying people and diagnosing them early and enabling them to participate in research, managing their health, accessing treatments when available. It's all part of a pathway, and I think, we need to make sure that public health and the science and research is integrated fully across the pathway, because I think that will benefit everyone in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. I'll then turn to Richard next.
Thanks very much. So I think this is an incredibly important question that this fringe is looking at, and it's perhaps even more important than it first sounds, because if the last 18 months has shown us anything, it's not just the close association between public health and science, it's actually the close association between those things and the wider economy and fabric of society. So it's a crucial topic as we look to the next phase of the pandemic, and of course we have the backdrop of change in the UK as it seeks to be a global science superpower post-Brexit. So it's incredibly important. First thing I want to say is that I'm not actually a scientist myself, but I can speak from having worked at Pfizer during what's been, for me, the most rewarding and intense and crazy kind of periods of my career, and I think I can say that for many of my colleagues. I'll personally never forget the moment in December last year when Margaret Keenan became the first woman in the world to receive the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine on a national vaccination program here in the UK. It took just 259 days between Pfizer and BioNTech announcing our partnership and the UK medicines regulator being the first in the world to provide temporary authorization. And since then, we've seen over 1.6 billion doses of the vaccine distributed to 130 different countries and territories around the world. We've allocated 1 billion doses for supply at cost to low and lower middle income countries in 2021 and a further 1 billion in 22. And just this last weekend, we're really pleased to announce an expansion of our global manufacturing operations for the vaccine by bringing Thermo Fisher's Swindon site into our into our global network of manufacturing organizations. It's a £70 million investment in the UK and will create 200 new jobs for Thermo Fisher. But the UK's vaccine success, be that the amazing story of the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine through to the rolling out of multiple vaccines at a scale never seen before to the general population. It's only one part of the pandemic story when it comes to science. We've seen world-class capabilities in clinical research. The recovery trial is a centerpiece of that. We've seen world-class capabilities in genomics. And I think we've also seen the UK really leading on the global stage through things like the G7 and the Pandemic Preparedness Partnership, which is setting new targets for the discovery and development of new vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics in future epidemic and pandemic scenarios, which are really quite staggering. The 100 days target is something which I think the whole sector clearly will need to exhibit the same kind of level of collaboration and partnership as we've seen over the last year. So against that backdrop, where next for the UK? The government's definitely talking the talk when it comes to its ambitions on science. I think the ambition is crystal clear. We've got the 2.4% target for GDP by 2027 for R&D. We've got the life sciences vision. We've got the integrated review, making this science a central element of the of foreign policy. But I think the challenge now is translating those bold ambitions into equally bold actions. So I think that brings us to the question, what can we learn from the pandemic? Of course, this is partly about the funding of science, and I'm sure we can get into some of that discussion later on. But let me leave you with sort of three key lessons from our perspective. The first is that innovation within pharmaceuticals and life sciences doesn't happen by accident. It takes time. It requires the careful cultivation over the long term of an interconnected set of pro-innovation policies. And George, you mentioned it. The UK's successes during the pandemic on science arose in part because successive governments have invested in and recognized the need to nurture life sciences. But at the same time, my second lesson is that success also came about because the UK pioneered some completely new approaches for engaging with its partners. And I think the model of the UK Vaccines Task Force is something that we can certainly draw a lot from and seek to apply in future, and would be very happy to get into that in the discussion later. And then the final lesson is just the value of innovation to society. So innovation comes in many forms. It doesn't always mean big scientific breakthroughs like mRNA vaccines or big investments. It can mean new approaches and new ways of working, like the Vaccines Task Force, like the way the MHRA has worked during the pandemic. But the UK has absolutely shown that the NHS can be a beacon of innovation for the rest of the world, in particular through its vaccine rollout. And that's not something we've always been able to say over recent years, but I think the UK has shown the world what it can achieve. So we have to, as we look ahead, apply this ethos and these key lessons to future challenges. I know there's a number of them that we can get into and talk about, in particular this transition towards a more prevention-oriented healthcare system, I think, is going to be critical. I think that links to some of the themes around health inequalities that have been picked up by other speakers, and there are many other areas as well. I think I'll probably wrap it there, but look forward to getting into the discussion.
Thank you, Richard. And Mike?
Thank you, Robert. I don't think it's by chance that much of what I'm going to say echoes that which has been said. So over the last 18 months, an increasing number of people have seen just how important scientific data are for making important clinical and public health decisions, i.e. following the science. However, although science, like oxygen, is critical and everywhere, many people still don't recognize it in their daily lives. Let's use physiology. I'm a physiologist as an example. Physiology is the science of how your body works, doesn't work, and can be made to work better. It underpins how you sense the world. Look at yesterday's Nobel Prize. How long you survive in the sea, and how well you can run the London or Manchester marathons. It also determines what illnesses you catch, if you have children and when you have them, and eventually what kills you. It's been at the forefront of answers at every stage of the pandemic. COVID-19, as we know, was a novel disease that medicine had not faced before. Physiology was the key to unlocking many of the mysteries of its effects on the body. The rapid work of the Physiological Society and physiologists in understanding this enabled treatments to be developed quickly and undoubtedly saved lives. So we're now facing huge public health challenges, one of them being long COVID. And as I speak, physiologists across the world are working to shed light on the cause, symptoms, and solutions. Physiology is also at the front line of other public health challenges, from understanding the root cause of obesity to supporting people to live healthier for longer into old age. It's also helping to understand the impact of climate change on human health, productivity, and survivability. So lesson one, the importance of science, expertise, and data in decision making. And lesson two, the importance of collaboration and funding. Whether it's vaccines or treatments, we saw from the pandemic that our ability to respond quickly to public health challenges requires building on decades of basic research. Science is a marathon, not a sprint, a team rather than an individual effort. The mRNA vaccines that are now saving so many lives are founded on fundamental scientific research undertaken in the mid-20th century. They have been produced by collaboration between molecular biologists, virologists, immunologists, lipid chemists, and supported by industry and government. The building blocks were constructed by basic research over many years. They were then available to be assembled into a new vaccine in record time when needed in a time of crisis. The lesson from COVID is that our best defense is a robust, diverse science base that we can call upon when really needed. The government has the ambition to make the UK a science superpower. But the R&D intensity as a proportion of GDP in the UK is around 1.7%, some way below the OECD average of 2.5%. At the spending review next month, the government will hopefully achieve its commitments to increase public R&D spend by 24-25 to 22 billion and keep us on track to reach at least 2.4% of GDP spend on research by 2027. The lesson from the last 18 months is that we can't afford to miss these targets. COVID has shown how science, business, and politics can rapidly work together to respond to a public health crisis. But the impressive response was founded on an existing research base. Going forward, this cannot be taken for granted and should be nurtured. Finally, it should also not be assumed that people understand the importance of the scientific method for making informed decisions. Without this understanding, they are less likely to follow its lead. There's much work to be done also in this area. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I'd like to just return to the Minister to pick up on one thing. You said in your opening remarks that strategies work, and that was one of the key learnings. Back in 2010, I know that the government considered cutting the science budget and then ended up resisting that. Do you feel like the political argument around investment in science has been won, or is there still more to do?
I think the truth is, when you're carrying the biggest debt since 1760, there's always more to do. We have to keep making the argument. And listen, there'll be no more doughty defender and advocate for science in government than me. But I think we in the science community, if I can put it like that, have also got to be very cognizant that, the people who are paying our bills, the people whose taxes are being collected to pay for all this, when they hear 22 billion science, we had better show them really clearly the value of every pound and how that will not just help to keep them safe. And I think the public have, in a way that perhaps they haven't before, seen the very immediate value of UK science. I've never felt this year a sense more of the sort of whole public so proud of UK life science, which is a wonderful thing. But I think we've got to keep making the argument, and I will be, that science superpower links to innovation nation, links to jobs of tomorrow, prosperity for tomorrow, clusters all around the country. If people, as cost of living pressures rise in a pretty tough winter, start to feel like we're hosing money into big laboratories that have got nothing to do with them, there will be political resistance. So I think there's always more to do. The Prime Minister completely gets it, the Chancellor gets it. I mean, I think you can hear this week, you heard it in the Chancellor's speech yesterday, a very strong commitment to making this, the post-COVID recovery and Brexit, a moment to commit to a different economic model for this country. And I think there's a strong political will, but we can't beat around the bush. There's also very strong pressure on the public finances. And we need to show as a community that we're going to turn every pound that we can get into 5, 10 pounds of inward investment, innovation, job creation, prosperity. And we need to show that the science funding engine is a Formula One engine that takes millilitres of money and turns it into incredible dynamism in the economy. So there's always more to do.
Excellent, and I think, you'll have some interesting conversations, I'm sure, in the build-up to the spending review, which I know is only three or so weeks away. Another question just for our other speakers on the panel, and perhaps I might come to you first, Mike, on this one. With COVID, we had a new disease, a new pathology, and there was a lot to understand and to get our heads around, and then to come up with the responses, and obviously quite a lot of public interest in that. With some of the other challenges that we've talked about, ageing, obesity, these have been endemic issues facing society for a number of years. How do we sort of capture the public's interest in understanding the drivers of disease better and sort of get them bought into campaigns in those other areas?
Yeah, there's definitely a marketing job to be done with the general public, and I think COVID did it for us to some extent, and as we've just heard from the Minister. But there are other enormous public health issues that are draining the National Health Service. And you've mentioned some of them. And it's getting people to understand the critical importance of science. And I think probably the word we're going to hear more and more going forward is impact. The impact of science in terms of what science is doing and what it's returning in terms of everyday life. And we just need to get people to understand two things. One is that science is all around them. The whole fact that we're sitting here talking, people are listening online, that's science. And the second thing is science, at its basis, is a way of making informed decisions. And so if something has been arrived at scientifically, that trumps belief or what you think might be the right thing to do. And I think that's another important aspect of what we need to sell in terms of science as a decision-making tool.
Thank you. Susan?
I mean, I think Mike's made some very fair points there. And I think that communication point is really important. And how do we ensure the science community can share back what they're doing? How do research trials feed back to participants? I think that's improved in recent years, but I think there's a lot more we can do. How do we, if people have given their time, feed back to them about the progress the research has made? I think that's a really important point. I think, I'll finish there for that one.
Yeah, and Richard, obviously there's been exceptional interest in vaccines in probably a way that no one could have imagined 2 years ago. How might we sort of capture that interest when we think about other therapeutic challenges that we might have coming down the track?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a simple answer on to that question. I mean, but you're absolutely right. I mean, if you think about the public's knowledge of the different stages that go into a clinical trial. I mean, in a role like mine, in the past, you often spend a lot of your time explaining this stuff, and now we almost have a captive audience, and it's so important across a number of different areas. Let me give you one example. Which is antimicrobial resistance. And it has been shown already to lead to 700,000 deaths globally a year. That's predicted to rise to 10 million in 2050 if action is not taken. That's more people than currently die of cancer. And there are many aspects to that, but a critical part of it is public education, is helping people understand the steps that they can take as individuals to help address that fundamental kind of global issue, and I think it's the responsibility of companies like mine is really important here too, and we have to have outreach. We have to be getting out into the community to talk to people about topics like this. We have a schools program on the topic of superbugs and antimicrobial resistance, which is incredibly successful, and we find people are very receptive to, but it's going to take all of us to I think capitalise on this moment.
I'm keen to bring in the audience to ask some questions, so if you could raise your hand. We have one rule at Policy Exchange, which is there is no question too outrageous, provided you state your name and your organisation. So we've got a roving mic. We'll go to this gentleman in the blue shirt there, followed by the gentleman in the front here.
Thank you for that permission, Mr. Eid. I'll make my most outrageous comment straight away, which is that to my ears, as a scientist and a taxpayer, the lessons which the panel have declared they've learned appear to be the same lessons that homeopathic apologists would learn. They learn what we did right. Nobody has commented on what they did wrong. So I applaud the vaccine task force and the success of the rollout, but I'm really quite disappointed that the lack of attention that I'm aware of to how obesity and vitamin D deficiency is factored into COVID, how hospitals were cleared into care homes, how the cost-benefit analysis of masking and social distancing has been completely, to my understanding, omitted, how vaccine safety, heart damage and clotting has been, in a spirit of promoting something that's more good than bad, those aspects have been brushed under the carpet, thus feeding a wild-eyed conspiracy theorists of anti-vaxxers, because they believe that you deny the truth, whereas I suspect you're just accentuating the positive and de-emphasizing the negative. That and the lamentable lack of transparency and quality assurance of the testing labs, which my taxes have paid for, but I harangue my MP for the quality assurance data of false positive and false negative information and deny that information. I've spoken to the testing lab. If we could bring it towards a question, that would be fantastic. The question is, what the hell do you think you're doing if you can only talk about the positive and appear to disingenuously ignore the negative?
Let me deal with that, if I may.
Yeah, George, would you like to come in?
Yeah. Look, in 3 minutes, you can't cover all of the lessons from COVID. It's a ridiculous prospect. But the question demands some answers. Let me be direct about it. Firstly, I did mention obesity, and I tried to focus on... let me answer the question, if I may. Thanks. But you've raised some good points, and that's why there will be a full inquiry into the failures as well. This was a massive test for the UK public health system, and in lots of ways, it failed. And everyone in the system knows that, in the same way that the Battle of Britain was a massive test. In the end, we won it. But there were tons of mistakes made. And I want to be very clear with you, there's absolutely... the phrase I really agree with you on is the wild-eyed conspiracy. And it is your central point, I think, is that science, clarity, transparency, accountability, peer review are the building blocks on which you build public trust and confidence. And I think you're right that through the speed and scale of the public emergency, a government has to take big decisions very fast. You haven't got time to do all the science at the speed and scale that you would normally do. You do have to make some very big decisions. And I think there are actually a lot of lessons that have already been learned about the real impact of different interventions, masking. There's a whole raft of lessons that are being learned now. I couldn't cover them all in 3 minutes. But I just wanted to respond immediately to the idea that we're complacent. We're not at all. And I think my opening comments captured the sense that the big lesson here is to stop the siloed model of primary health here, community health here, hospital health here. The integration and the data and the accountability are the fundamental lessons for the UK public health and healthcare system. I'll leave other colleagues' comments on the transparency of data, but I didn't want you to think for a minute that I'm complacent, because I'm absolutely not.
We'll take a couple more questions, if that's all right. So the gentleman at the front, and then we'll go to the lady in the row there in the middle.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I'm Abdul Mateen from the Isle of Wight Conservative Association. We saw the first world wanted to help the third world in the 70s, fighting cholera, malaria, and the vaccinations to save children, infant lives. And by the time the infants were 5, they died of starvation. The policy changed, American policy, where the food aid was given regardless of their political beliefs. Suddenly they said, right, unless you support American policy, we're not going to give you the food aid. So we saw children, infants' death by the time they were 5. Now, you mentioned, George, we have a big national debt. We need to pay that debt. I have to follow Germany, China, Japan, and live on a surplus. Living today at the expense of tomorrow isn't sensible. So we saw the COVID vaccination come quickly. If we can do that and make public life, save lives, then we need to make sure that no infant and no children in this country are going hungry. So all of this is linked together, and the progress that we are seeking has to be found, and lessons have to be learned from the mistakes. And how are we going to do that is the main question to you, George. Thank you.
Thanks. And then we had an arm just in there, and then we'll take a third question as well. So the gentleman at the back in the last row.
Hi, I'm Jess. I'm from Stirling. Both my parents work in research, but it's like far back in. So they work in cancer research, but it's the stuff where it's all the weird letter combos and number combos where I don't know what it means. And it's how do we get when it is this really complex stuff that's so far away from actual treatment, but is so crucial. How do we convince the public that that's worth the money when realistically we can't expect them to understand it and shouldn't expect them to understand it?
Thanks, a really, really great question. And then just the gentleman at the back.
Thank you. Chinook Mediwaka from North London. I'm not a scientist, but as a non-scientist reading about British science, one thing which does concern me is the amount of research that seems to start here and then sort of be carried forward elsewhere overseas. I'm just wondering, is this a case of, is this just purely a case of us needing to invest more in R&D, as I think one of the speakers mentioned, or are there maybe other factors we need to think about in terms of making sure British science, to the extent it's possible, stays here and is developed here?
Okay, great. So quite a wide-ranging set of questions there. So one, really looking at sort of child hunger and how we can think about this holistically. Second question around long-term science and how can we ensure that there's patient capital around that and also patient support. And then finally around sort of making sure that the UK maximises its advantages and stuff stays here. Susan, could I bring you in maybe just to share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think all three of those points are really valid. In terms of that kind of child poverty, you know, it clearly speaks as kind of wider determinants of health. If we're looking at using science and innovation to improve public health, then actually if people simply aren't being fed, then that is a legitimate point. And I think, as ever, it speaks to the point about we need to look at this holistically. And obviously, inevitably, public health extends beyond the health and science remit, and it does extend more broadly, which is why I think when the Office for Health Improvement Disparities was first announced a few months ago, there was a commitment to a kind of cross-ministerial board, which I think would be hugely positive, and I hope that is enacted because I think it is the cross-cutting kind of government responsibility, which actually could hopefully make some progress on that. In terms of the basic research, I think that's a really valid point. It's very hard when you're very far from kind of people to make that case. And as a biomedical research charity, I know that that's an issue. We all work hard. I think there is a way to do that. And I think at every stage you can bring science back to people and show them why it matters. And I think we all have a responsibility as either scientists or people who fund science to actually make sure that message is clear. We can do it. And I think, as George said, we need to carry on justifying it, because actually the basic research is the building blocks which we build on to get to ever more applied science and clinical research, which will actually benefit the general public and patients. And then finally, the point about kind of when trials go wrong and how we going abroad, I think that is a valid point, and certainly within the trial space in the UK for dementia research, we've seen quite a lot of innovation happening in the UK, and to actually late-stage clinical trials are big. They are global. I'm sure other colleagues will comment on that. I think there's more we can do, and I think the learnings from COVID have shown how we can make trial design more adaptable. We can be more responsive. Some of the changes to the way that clinical trials are set up in the UK, I think, could be adapted. It's challenging, but there are ways forward, and I hope we can learn from COVID. The success of the recovery trial, the use of things like platform trials. I think we are innovative in this country, and I agree. I think we can do more to just continue that innovation to the late stage.
Mike.
So just a couple of points, really. Firstly, I think there are plenty of starting points for demonstrating the value of the kind of work which your parents did. And the vaccine is an obvious one, in that it dates back to research that was done in the 1960s that produced those building blocks which Susan has mentioned. But you can take anything. You can take light, you can take heating, you can take how you sense this environment, and you can go back to those building blocks. There's plenty of opportunity to do that. And as long as people realise that that's the the base on which all of this has happened, then I think there's plenty of opportunity to do that. I think the collaboration thing is probably more so the work going abroad, I think, is probably a model of some years ago now. I think what you'll find is mostly now this is much more multinational collaborative teams that are working in research, and it doesn't really go abroad. It's just international groups get together, and that's the only way we're going to address the big science issues. It's by collaboration. It'll be collaboration across disciplines as well. And just a final point about COVID in the early days, what we need to remember is that COVID was a novel disease, but it was looking like something we knew about, which obviously made life difficult. And it's all about data, and as data were accumulated about this new disease, then decision-making improved. And so if you make sure that your decisions are founded on data, and you collect those data, and you apply that then to the basic science that exists, you then have a success story in the end.
Minister.
Three great questions. Abto, I think if I got your name right, you made a very powerful point. There's not much point saving people from disease if they then die from hunger, I think was your point. And I think that's a really important point, both internationally, but also here in the UK. Bring you back to the point I was making about public health. It's an irony of COVID. One of the lessons is we were more susceptible as an economy and as a population because of that chronic disease, obesity-related chronic disease syndrome. It would be ironic to vaccinate people with an amazing vaccine and then ignore the underlying condition that made them so susceptible. Yeah. And I think that's a big lesson here in the UK as well as internationally. And the reason I set up the Reform for Resilience Commission, based initially in the richer northern countries, focused on the G20, is that I didn't want the lesson to be, we just got to order more PPE next time. The big lesson is about, yes, be pandemic prepared, but pandemic avoidance, which ultimately speaks to taking population health much more seriously and building healthier growth into every company, better diet, better workforce, better commute patterns, better designed cities. If we're really going to learn the long-term lesson, it's healthier growth. Jess, I thought it's a brilliant question, and I've got three powerful answers for you, I think. Firstly, thank you to your parents. I mean, if I was you as a young woman, I'd say the best answer is breast cancer has gone from being a kiss of death, a curse, to 95% curable. It's a treatable disease now. And I think the figure is high 90s. But if you detect early, it's a treatable disease, total cure. That's because of the work your parents have done. And if that doesn't make every young woman of your age feel proud, I don't know what would. Second answer, you know, if we look at the global challenges, we have to double world food production in the next 30 years with half as much land, energy and water. I'm optimistic, because if you unleash the full power of UK science, global science, you know, we've got here at the Norwich Research Park plants that will grow in drought conditions without water, or without as much water as they used to. We've got disease-resistant crops that don't need 14 applications of highly carbon-intensive fungicide. I mean, we are incubating the technologies in renewable energy, in plant science, in medicine, in energy, that are going to make sustainable growth a reality for the planet. I mean, that is incredibly inspiring. And if that doesn't float your boat, I'd say to people, we're building the clusters of tomorrow's industries all around the country, not just in Cambridge, but in Teesside, in Aberdeen, in Northern Ireland, in South Wales. We're building the jobs of tomorrow, and that ultimately is taking science and turning it into innovation, companies and clusters. But it's a great question to ask, and I hope that answer helps. And, you know, on your question about sort of brain drain, I think the kind of brain drain of scientists, pure scientists, has stopped, I think largely because of the globalization of science collaborations. But where I am really worried is the brain drain of innovation. And so my portfolio is Minister for Science, Technology and Innovation. All of the research funding budgets, it's an unbelievable portfolio of assets, UKRI, the research councils, the university research, all of our public laboratories. I mean, it's an incredible arsenal, which I have the awesome responsibility for accounting to Parliament for and helping to steer. But also the innovation bit, and my focus will be science superpower and innovation nation. Science superpower is about making sure we continue to invest in world-class science. We pull in much more global inward investment, and we show the power of UK science to tackle global challenges. The innovation nation bit is about making sure that we build an ecosystem for better commercializing. And the truth is, for decades, this country has been pretty poor, actually, at converting science pound into innovation, companies, businesses and clusters. And we've been floating far too many companies on AIM at 10, 20 million that get bought up by the Americans and refloated on NASDAQ for 200 million. It's bonkers. We've got the world's greatest financial centre and the world's greatest science engine. How about connecting them and making the UK a platform for scaled up businesses that can take science innovation around the world? And that is really going to be the main focus of my work. Because if I can do that, I think the argument about public funding becomes much easier.
Richard, and then I'll throw it out to some more questions.
Yeah, just one start that struck me before when we were talking about you know, some of the chronic underlying health issues within our society. I think the Health Secretary said this yesterday evening, actually, at a Policy Exchange event. We currently spend 5% of our healthcare budget on prevention, 40% on treating preventable conditions, and that figure, I think, speaks for itself. But I wanted to sort of zone in on this question about, I guess, investment in the UK, because meeting this UK R&D target, which is highly ambitious, will require both public and, in particular, private investment to get there. And I speak from the perspective of a large multinational company which has a significant UK footprint. We spend just shy of £300 million a year on UK R&D, with our largest R&D site in Europe here in the UK. And I think large companies can be anchor investors. They can spur collaborations with academia, with companies kind of around our operations. And I think it's really important, therefore, that we look at how we can nurture that. Look into the future. So what can we do to kind of make the most of our sort of private investment into R&D? Definitely, as I said earlier, the UK has shown that it is global leading on science when it comes to COVID, and that does matter a lot, because these assets like our genomics capabilities that George mentioned earlier, that have been invested in by the government and by others over decades, really do matter and send a really important global signal. I think there are some things that we could do around the competitiveness of the UK R&D landscape. So I know there are some discussions at the minute about something like, so the UK has a great R&D tax credit regime, but there are some areas where it perhaps could be modernised to bring it into line with some other global competitors, like, for example, France and Singapore. There's an opportunity there, I think, in the spending review coming up. And then I'd say we've got another really big opportunity around clinical research, which has been mentioned by colleagues in the discussion. But just to add to that, I think we've got an opportunity here, building on increased public awareness of clinical research, building on its importance as has been shown through COVID, to actually use some of the healthcare reforms going through at the minute, the creation of integrated care systems, to actually embed duties to promote clinical research within and across the NHS. And I think there are actions like that which can be incredibly important here in terms of shaping the wider kind of R&D investment environment looking ahead.
Hands up again, another opportunity to bring people in. So we've got three hands in the back, so we'll just take them along the row.
Hi there, James Dixon from West Ham. My question is, for COVID, obviously a huge unprecedented challenge, but that came with a huge platform to communicate science, and that made it, in a sense, easier to deal with, because you're able to communicate to the public and it matters to them every single day. Their lives were changed. But what about things like active travel, social prescribing, etc.? The science of it is very, very well known, but whether or not there's the communication opportunity for that, it could make a huge difference. And I'd encourage everyone to read, it was a fantastic book, The Miracle Pill, by Guardian journalist Peter Walker. Literally walking to the shops, cycling, etc. All of these small things make a huge difference to our lives and can enable us to live longer and live healthier later lives as well. But as I say, it's not a particularly sexy thing to talk about. So how do we bridge that gap? Thanks.
Hi, Tom Addison from the Physiological Society. I just wanted to pick up on some of the stuff that I think Mike and George and Richard have mentioned and bring it all together and ask you what your ambitions are for the spending review outside and the 2.4% target outside of the Golden Triangle. So how we spread that innovation nation across outside of London, Cambridge and Oxford. Thank you.
Great, and then a question just at the end of that row.
Emmanuel Aluko from Chelmsford Conservatives. Two questions, if I may. The first one is the outcomes we had as a result of COVID-19. You've mentioned, Minister, that you think it's partly because of the physiology of the citizens of the UK. I would like to get your view on what you think about the impact openness of the UK had, and the US as well, on that outcome. Because we have some other countries in the world, one might be New Zealand, I don't know if the physiology of the average citizen there is similar to ours, but the outcomes are quite different from ours because obviously they've been quite closed. And now they're pretty much abandoning their zero COVID strategy, because that has proved to be very difficult to maintain. Secondly, I'd like to ask, what is the balance, if anybody knows, of how much investment takes place between the government and the private sector? Because I think it was mentioned that the government spends about 1.7% of GDP on research and development. I would like to see if there's how much the private sector does in addition to that, and what the balance is like. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So what's the communication opportunity around sort of behavioural lifestyle factors? Can we level up beyond the Golden Triangle, the spending review, and then a bit about the physiology and differences between countries and their approaches, and then the ratio between spending versus public versus private. So, Minister, could I ask you to respond first?
Thank you. Three more great questions. The Policy Exchange audience is on fire this morning. No sign of late night damage to the neural network. So, James, I mean, The Miracle Pill is a brilliant book, and you heard in my opening comments, I was focusing on that very issue. Oh, okay, yeah. So I started on, the big lesson is, actually we were more susceptible as an economy because of those underlying chronic disease comorbidities that are linked to obesity and cardiorespiratory syndrome. So I made the point that if we're going to have healthier and cleaner growth, the truth is that active travel, healthier living, the basics of walking to work, cycling a bit, getting off the tube a stop earlier and walking the last bit, little things every day, watching your steps, actually make a huge difference. And couldn't agree more. And my first point was that to me, the really big lesson is not to go back to neglecting that. And the shift left, which Sajid has picked up, to shift the focus of our healthcare system to health and care instead of disease treatment, and to invest more in prevention, and to create that virtuous cycle where hospitals start to need or want fewer visits, and we can free up space in the hospitals and then do more clinical research and create that circle of virtue where people can have better care at home and use more digital health, and then have a one-to-one face-to-face consultation with a GP, which can be 15 or 20 minutes, not 6, because the system's been freed up. So I completely agree, and it starts with that healthier daily living. And if we're going to hit net zero, that'll be as important as the big investment in science. Tom, I'm so glad you asked the Golden Triangle question. So here's my answer. The Golden Triangle is indeed golden. It's called that because it is a fundamental shining jewel in the crown of the UK R&D economy. How we're going to grow the R&D economy beyond it is not by reducing the size of the Golden Triangle. It's by the things I was talking about earlier. Firstly, making sure that we're leading more in the emerging sectors of tomorrow. I mean, the pace of science and technology, the pace of new sectors that are emerging is going to require a more agile UKRI, a more agile funding mechanism. I think at the moment we're funding some deep excellence, but I'm a bit worried that some of the silos are very narrow, and some of the most exciting areas of science are where food meets medicine, where agri meets energy, where fusion meets biochemistry. I mean, there's some extraordinary opportunities, and we've got to have a very agile system so that we can start to build those new clusters. And as I set out in the report to the Prime Minister earlier this year, the PM Task Force on Innovation, Growth and Regulatory Reform, we do have an opportunity outside the EU, which is legislating for 27 countries, to regulate for innovation in this country. In clinical trials, the EU is regulating to make sure that every trial in Europe, in Lithuania, is safe. Very important. That shouldn't be the gold standard for the UK. We should be raising the bar and setting the new standards for digital, fast, patient-recruited, patient-empowered clinical trials off the back of COVID. So I think there's a huge opportunity for us to create new clusters in hydrogen, in aerospace in Cornwall and Scotland, in plant science in Aberystwyth and Norwich, in hydrogen all around the country, in nanotechnology. There are clusters all around the country. That's how we'll grow. But it comes off a basic science platform, which has its roots quite heavily, not exclusively, but quite heavily in that Golden Triangle. And lastly, Emmanuel, interesting question about closed and open countries. If you look at the Reform for Resilience Commission, our June report, one of the things we did in the first 6 months of the year was look at the actual experience in the first 15 months of the pandemic. And the interesting lesson is some countries got some things really right, some also got things wrong. No country completely smashed it. So we were a bit slow at the beginning and then completely nailed the vaccine. Germany was brilliant at the beginning. They had really good ICU capacity, and then they struggled in phase 2 because of the lander and regional politics. And New Zealand and Australia, in New Zealand, very quick to shut their borders, much easier for them, much harder for us, which I think is your point. And Australia, very good at the beginning. They topped the charts in March 2020. Then they really struggled with cross-contamination and a lack of an ability to begin to open up. So there are lessons from every country. Big challenge for us is, as a global trading nation, very reliant on shipping, marine, aviation, people trading globally. How do you build those open supply chains in a way that are COVID compliant? And I think that's one of the big lessons from this pandemic, which we're going to have to think very deeply about, is biosecurity and having a really agile and nimble system that means we pick up much more quickly and we can detect and we can be much more specific about which countries are suddenly on the red list for 3 days. And it move away from this clunky system of big block bans to a much more agile system in the same way that regulation can be much more agile.
Thank you. Susan, and then I'll go to Mike.
Yeah, thanks. I think in terms of that communication and framing, I think how do you share those messages? I think that's really important. We've seen the dementia space actually trying to reframe dementia risk reduction as brain health. Far more appealing. I think there's a lot more we can do to think about how you frame some of those messages to appeal, to engage. I think that's very important. I think also things like changes in the health sector with things like integrated care systems also encourage the whole system to think about the journey from the start of someone's health throughout their life. And while that will be a long-term outcome, I think there is that opportunity around that. A point about the spending review, I just think this kind of perhaps aligns with the levelling up point. We know that often within clinical research, we don't have particularly good representation. The Golden Triangle doesn't necessarily reflect the full diversity of the UK. I think there's a real opportunity to actually expand that with spending review, with levelling up, to actually how do we ensure that we have research and science taking place in the right places across the UK to reflect the breadth of the population, because I think that will, again, provide a much better foundation. And then just a final point, I know you talked about investment, but I would just put a call out for biomedical research charities, probably fund over £1 billion of biomedical research, so don't forget us about as a sector. Thanks.
Mike.
Very quickly, I'm conscious of time. On the spending side, I recommend R&D spending. The report just published 2021 by the House of Commons Library by George Hutton. You can get all the data you need in terms of the split between the business sector and the public sector in terms of funding. In terms of the ambition for the spending review, it's to stay on course for 2.4% of GDP by 2027. However, I'm absolutely on the same page as the Minister in terms of that has to be able to demonstrate return, impact and innovation. They talk about most of the general public get their information about science through the media, and there's a real need for the media and scientists to engage. It's much better now than it was 30 years ago, but it could improve more, and the scientists could actually explain where some of these innovations come from as part of that process. It's a cliche, but prevention is better than cure. And so anything we can do to understand what we need to do to prevent susceptibility in individuals and the variation between individuals, which is a fundamental concept in physiology, will help us going forward. And finally, I mean, we tend, when we learn about research and science, to learn more and more about less and less. So you become an expert in a very narrow area. But as we've already said, some of these big questions require collaboration. You need experts, absolutely you need experts. But we really need to try and facilitate the way those experts can work together across disciplines in terms of our funding models, in terms of our, the models, the way we group scientists. So I think that's probably an important way forward as well.
Now, time is rapidly coming up to us. So what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to name the one thing that they think is the absolutely key lesson that they would take from the UK's response to the COVID-19 pandemic when it comes to thinking about the role of science in public health challenges, and then we'll thank and close. So I'll start with Richard.
Yeah, very simply, so the power of having a central mission to advance innovation for patients, because ultimately all of this discussion around science and R&D is academic if we're not ultimately getting new treatments through to patients for key challenges that they have.
And Susan?
I think it's a whole integrated pathway that you need science at every stage to reap benefits across all of it.
And the Minister?
Harness the global corporate shock at their susceptibility to infectious disease by putting H into ESG investing, so that we mainstream population health and public health as an investable part of our globalised economy.
And lastly, Mike.
How good I can go last, so I can have all of those. I can agree with all of those. And I can also add getting the general public to appreciate science and, importantly, appreciate how science helps people make important decisions. There's been a battle recently, I think, between belief and truth, and science is a mechanism by which we can make important decisions.
Thank you. Well, I think we can definitively say that experts are back in fashion.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for joining and for all of your excellent questions. I'd also like to thank the Physiological Society for supporting this event. Have a fantastic rest of your conference.